This is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about what could be called the philosophy of shame and ostracism. Um, this is something that I'm very passionate about and have wanted to talk about for a while now, and I've finally been able to formulate some thoughts and some philosophy about the philosophy of shame and ostracism. Now, you're probably wondering what the philosophy of shame and ostracism would look like, what kind of arguments would be at play. It's definitely something that's been thought about a lot by psychologists, particularly psychologists with a philosophical bent, such as Joel Gold in his book Suspicious Minds, in terms of thinking about shame in terms of mental illness as well as ostracism in terms of mental illness. It definitely comes up in philosophy of psychology and psychology in general. And it's definitely featured in the works of Foucault, people that think about power structures. So that would also include people like Judith Butler, who have kind of implied that there are certain power structures at play that can create shame. And so there's definitely that to draw on. But to start off, I'm actually going to start off with one of my own thoughts about shame and something that I've noticed about shame. Essentially, shame is circular in nature. So you feel shame because of stigma and treatment by society, but the treatment increases the feeling of shame. So essentially, the way in which you're treated by society is highly linked to the shame that you feel. So essentially, they are a vicious circle, and you have the shame because of the way you're treated by society, but you're treated by society because of your shame, and specifically the reasons of why you have the shame to begin with. So just something to keep in mind for now. Now, I once talked to a philosophy professor, and I was being very candid about my mental illness and telling him how I feel like sometimes I'm kind of dropped down a peg in society, or I'm treated differently, or I'm treated inferior because of this mental illness, even though I try to explain to people that it's actually not as debilitating as it seems. Certainly there's problems that come along with it, but essentially it doesn't define me. I am not my illness. And he basically said that when people approach you that way, it's not necessarily a rational argument. And I think he's right to say that, because that kind of attitude of putting you a peg below is the same argument that's used for many, many different issues, such as sexism and racism. And it's been used and employed by people for centuries. Even Jefferson has used this argument to some degree, Thomas Jefferson, to debunk race. There's this, specifically African Americans, and he does this by saying that Phyllis Wheatley, who was an African American poet, is not an actual good poet, and he does that by putting her a peg below and saying that she's not a real poet compared to white literature, and it's pretty much the same kind of argument. And that's Thomas Jefferson that said that, so it's pretty surprising. And so indeed, this is an argument that leads to sexism and the like. And the point is that these kind of arguments can lead people to feel shameful. It can lead them to feel embarrassed about whatever they have, which can be very destructive if that embarrassment is pushed further. Because there's a lot of criteria in which we judge people, such as their intelligence, such as their physical health, their mental health, of course, race and sex, as well as social status and intelligence and physical appearance. There's many ways in which we judge people that can lead to shame. And shame, so to put it in a nutshell, shame essentially comes from some perceived defect of the self. Now, I wanted to point out that this is unnecessary and even harmful in a utilitarian sense. So in a utilitarian sense, we want everything to have some kind of function and purpose and essentially utility. But by finding a way to induce shame in a person, there's no utilitarian effect or no utility of putting shame into someone. And I think that that's something that isn't talked about enough, but something that should be mentioned. So if you shame somebody because, they're a different race, then you haven't really done anything to make them more productive citizens of society. In fact, you've disabled that. And I think that that's something to keep in mind. So in that sense, just to kind of frame this, what function does shame have? And I'm going to go back to that in a minute, but just think about that for now. But essentially, it's very easy to say based off that there's no utilitarian effect of shaming somebody. Then, of course, there's always the in-group, out-group dichotomy, which is the idea that there's always the in-group, and the in-group is people that are us. And then there's them. And Foucault would definitely say the same thing about how we need to say that, as an example, we need to say that we're white so we can say that we're not black. So we need to say that we're us because we're not them. And so that's the same thing of the in-group and the out-group dichotomy. And so I want to offer two perspectives on this kind of in-group and out-group dichotomy. So there's definitely the evolutionary psychological perspective, which is the idea that we have out-groups because we're afraid of some kind of contamination. So Foucault definitely has a great argument where he describes how a long time ago lepers were, like in the Middle Ages, lepers were excluded from society because people were afraid of some kind of contaminant. They were afraid of getting contaminated by the disease. And interestingly, even though this isn't perfectly related, he describes how that became the criteria once leprosy was cured for judging people with mental illness, and mental illness became the new leprosy. That's more just something I mentioned just for the fun of it, but just something to keep in mind. But anyway, to get to my point, according to evolutionary psychology, we have these outgroups because we're afraid of contamination. And so that's one perspective. But if you look at, we'll take Hinduism, for instance, and the Eastern perspective. So in the Bhagavad Gita, there's this beautiful idea where every person is part of this larger incomprehensible whole. So we're part of this complex cosmology, we're a part of this complex universe, and we are not a cog. We are not a cog because we're not just a part of it, in the sense that because cog kind of carries a deterministic meaning, it's more we contribute to it because we are a part of it. So rather than just being something that's necessary to it in a deterministic sense, we're necessary to it because we are important to the whole. And so think about that. Which perspective would be more helpful for thinking about how we can utilize and maximize everybody's potential in society? Well, I would imagine, without wanting to pick sides, that even if evolutionary psychology explains very well why we have in-groups and out-groups, it seems that Hinduism does a good job explaining why it would not be a good idea to use that kind of criteria to judge people. And so it's something to keep in mind, because how would you feel if you felt very proud of yourself for being a part of the complex whole? To say that you're a part of not just Salt Lake City, to say that you're not just a part of Utah, you're not just a part of the United States, you're not just a part of the world, but you're a part of the universe. I think that that's something that the Bhagavad Gita and the universe and this argument of Hinduism definitely calls into question. Now, this is the point that I wanted to get at earlier, that I'm going to elucidate a little bit more clearly. And so the question is, what could be the social advantage of creating shame? There doesn't seem to be one, as shame pretty much disables. And so just keep that in mind. If you can think of a reason of why shame could actually be helpful, then I'm definitely all ears. But in my experience and based off the things that I've read and seen in other people, shame pretty much just leads to disabling behavior. It leads to a lack of confidence and stuff like that. Just checking the time. So just something to keep in mind. And I want to illustrate this kind of inutility and purposelessness of inducing shame in a person by talking briefly about a concept called social defeat by Joel Gold, who I mentioned earlier. So essentially what he describes is an experiment that was conducted of British civil servants, and he found out that essentially the lower they were in the hierarchy, pretty much the shorter they lived. And so the idea is that even a minor, so they weren't actually judged by race, and money wasn't really part of it. It was more just the fact that there was a hierarchy. Just the fact that there was a hierarchy was enough to shorten the life of whoever shorten the life more, depending on the lower you were on this social hierarchy, which I think is pretty important to consider. And so that's an example of social defeat, which is the idea that we're defeated because we're placed in a hierarchy. And so if you're judged and put in a hierarchy because of your sex, for example, or your race or whatever, then it definitely can lead you to feel socially defeated. Joel Gold has a great example where he describes how he felt shame when once a Frenchman insulted him, and it seemed like, but the Frenchman insulted him indirectly, so he did it by talking to someone else about him, and the Frenchman didn't know that Joel Gold understood French, and it was really crushing to him, and he was someone who was very privileged, and so this kind of and he felt really bad, and it definitely affected him negatively. And it can even affect your neurobiology. Essentially, when you experience social defeat enough times, it creates so much cortisol in the brain that it can be very harmful. A little bit of cortisol is good because it prepares you for your situation at hand, but too much cortisol can be very deadly. And so, anyway, the whole point of the social defeat concept is the idea that it's possible that if you're put a peg below multiple times in multiple situations by multiple people, which is called social defeat, then essentially you will essentially be defeated and destroyed, and it can negatively impact your health. So that's something to keep in mind. So again, briefly, I could talk about Foucault and his idea of power structures, and it seems that we definitely take power structures for granted. Now, is there a solution to all of this? Well, the solution seems to be to use shame to our advantage, to find a way to turn it into a strength. And it seems that there's three ways that we could do this. One is rejection. So we could, in terms of if we're looking at the outgroup, we could reject the outgroup. So if they reject us because we have a deformity, then what we would need to do is reject everybody who is normal and simply associate with people that have deformities. Then there's assimilation, where we find a way to somehow assimilate into understanding that we have a deformity and that we don't fit in, but finding a way to fit in nonetheless. So a good example is, of course, used in terms of whitewashing. So when Jews try to assimilate into America, and to try to do it that way. And then, of course, there's just giving up, or passivity, where you pretty much just let things happen. And so these are three views. I'm not going to go into depth talking about them because I don't have a whole lot of time. But I do want to point out kind of what I think about each of these perspectives. So the problem with rejecting out-groups and trying to form our own in-group is that it may perpetuate the same exact problem that we're trying to escape. And so that's one of the problems that I have with the idea of rejection. The problem with assimilation is that assimilation is more of a daydream, essentially. Assimilation is very hard to achieve because you're always going to be in contrast. So for instance, if you have a deformity, that deformity is always going to be in sharp contrast to whatever supposed perfection other people have. And of course, the problem with passivity is that you're essentially just giving up. So where does this leave us then? Well, essentially, it seems that, all of these things can lead us to feel shame, the way that we're treated by people. It can definitely lead us to feel shame. But what we have to do is we have to try to find a way to look at reality in a way that's going to be more freeing to us. Essentially, we have to accept whatever defect we have and find a way to live with that and cope with it. That can be difficult because there's so many factors that can lead us to be discriminated and the like, and that can lead us to feel shame. And that's pretty much about all I have to say. The last thing I want to say, though, is just the idea that shame is not something to take lightly. So if you feel shame and feel ashamed because of the way you're treated, then chances are that's a sign that there's a fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem usually is not you. In fact, I would say, for the most part, it isn't you. So if you're shamed and ashamed because of something that you have, something that society projects onto you, such as, they're not satisfied with your race or whatever, it's not necessarily a problem with you. And I think that once we can realize that, we can be in really good shape. And we can use the shame as kind of an alarm bell to figuring out what we need to do in order to coexist more harmoniously with people. Again, this is Phoenix, and thank you.